welcome to Conversations with Matt Delacre. We're continuing our discussion on science and Christianity with a look at miracles, or, more generally, God's actions in the world. The issue is this: if everything in this world operates on the basis of scientific laws, how can God act in this world? Wouldn't acting in this world to perform a miracle or answer a prayer mean that God would violate certain scientific laws, like the laws of physics? If that's true, and God cannot do anything in this world, then that means that no miracles have ever happened. That would include the resurrection of Jesus, since that was most definitely a miracle. And if that did not happen, then there is no Christianity. It would also mean that prayer is useless, because if God cannot answer your prayers, then what's the point of praying in the first place? Now, if there is no God, then obviously no miracles or answered prayers are going to happen. That should be pretty obvious. But this is not really where this question is coming from. This question is not so much about whether there is a God or not, but whether such a being could interact with creation. Perhaps there is a God who just set everything up at the beginning and then stepped back. Maybe God is like a master engineer who made creation and just let it run and doesn't or can't interfere with it. So, now that creation has been made, there's no room for God anymore. A lot of people think that because science has figured out so many of the laws that the universe operates on, that this is the way things must be. If there is a God at all, that is. God either won't or can't interact with the universe because the laws of that universe don't allow him to. So what's up? If there is a God, could the laws that govern the universe keep him outside of it? Would God have to violate the laws of the universe to be able to interact in it? Would acting in the universe break it, so to speak? Today we're going to look at this question. Before we begin, though, I would like to make a disclaimer. I have an interest in these topics, but I only have a layman's level of scientific knowledge. I'm getting pretty far outside of my field. As such, I'm going to try to stick to very generally held views and not say anything crazy. If I do make a mistake on the science, please forgive me. This is meant to be an introduction and not the final word. I'm just trying to get you thinking. In the interviews with actual scientists that follow the series, I asked both of them the question about miracles and whether God could interact in the world or not. So, in a few episodes, you'll get some professional opinions. Okay, here we go. The first place we need to look to answer the question about whether God can interact in the world or not is Newtonian mechanics, or classical mechanics. You know, force equals mass times acceleration. Every object in motion remains in motion in a straight line until it is acted upon by an outside force. That stuff. Now, Newton's three laws of motion worked really well. They worked so well, in fact, that they painted a picture of the universe as a great machine in which everything operated according to fixed laws. This made it possible for others to create a picture of God in which he did not interfere with the universe. This picture of God not interacting in the world became popular under the name deism, which is a belief in which God started everything back at the beginning and then never interfered after that. If you've ever heard of Thomas Jefferson's Bible, that is an example of deist thought. He went through the New Testament and cut out all the passages about miracles and many of those that reference the divine. Deists don't believe in miracles, even though they believe in God. So God may have started everything, but then he stepped away and let his machine run. Others, however, would see the same picture, the one of God not interacting, and conclude that there was no need for God at all. Many today think the same thing. Science explains how the world works, and there's no room left for a God, so why think that there is one? Whether there is a God or not is a really good question. We've talked about that in one other series so far, and there will be others in the future, which we take a look at that question again. For now, we're simply asking the question, if there is a God or gods, could he, she, it, or they interact with the universe? Do the laws that govern the universe keep a deity outside of it? Right now, we're looking at the universe like a giant machine that runs perfectly fine and has no need for interference. You see, way back when, people believed that God actually divinely caused the universe to run. It did not operate according to laws, God actually made it run. Even Newton believed that God made corrections every now and then. The idea that God is uninvolved and that the universe runs purely on laws is something that has only come about in the last few hundred years. So, back to our question. Can God interfere in the universe? If God were to perform a miracle or answer someone's prayer, would that break Newton's laws of motion? Would it throw a wrench into the great machine? Here we need to talk about an assumption that classical mechanics makes. It assumes a closed system. For something to be a closed system, it means that there is no interference from the outside. So, if we were playing a game of pool and I hit the cue ball into one or more other balls, classical mechanics will very accurately describe how all of those balls interact with one another, provided that no one messes with them. As long as the balls interact on their own, the system is closed. But if someone were to hit one of the balls while it were in motion, then obviously the system would no longer be closed. There has been interference from the outside. Let's take a minute and look at the law of the conservation of energy. This law states that the total energy of an isolated system cannot change. It is conserved over time. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can change form. An example is a stick of dynamite. Chemical energy is converted into kinetic energy when the dynamite explodes. So, here's a question. Could God create a full-grown horse in the middle of Times Square without violating the law of the conservation of energy? This would certainly be the creation of energy, or think matter if you prefer, which the law clearly said could not be done. And we know that a God could create a full-grown horse, no problem there. But would God creating energy, or matter, violate the law that said that this cannot be done? The answer is no, because the assumption behind this law is that the system is closed. Remember, it is an isolated system. That means that within the system of things in question, matter cannot be created or destroyed. That means that when everything that makes up Times Square is considered, people, buildings, etc., there cannot suddenly be a horse that shows up in that system as a result of things happening from within that system. However, God creating a horse in Times Square would be interference from the outside. God is an outside agent who is putting something into that system. He would be like the person hitting one of the balls in our game of pool. When you have an outside agent interfering in the system is no longer closed, which means that the laws no longer describe everything that is happening in that system. Do you understand what I'm saying? The laws only describe what is going on in the system as long as there is no interference from the outside. Every law that explains how the universe works assumes that there is no interference from anything from the outside of the universe. So if God were to do something in the universe, say a miracle or answering a prayer, it is actually impossible for him to violate a law. These laws describe how the universe operates without God. So obviously, with God, they do not apply. Therefore, it is actually impossible for God to violate any law of the universe. Okay, so there is no actual reason that God cannot perform a miracle or answer a prayer as a result of classical mechanics. What if we change things up a bit? Is there anything in quantum mechanics that says God can't interfere in the universe? Well, things are a bit different in quantum mechanics. In classical mechanics, we would get exact answers for where a thing is at a given time, whether that thing be a billiard ball, a horse, or anything else. In quantum mechanics, we would only have a probability for where a thing is at a given time. In other words, the determinism that exists in classical mechanics does not exist in quantum mechanics. Let's go back for a minute and think about playing pool again. In classical mechanics, if we know where all the balls are originally, the friction caused by the pool table surface, the amount of bounce the cushions produce, and every other conceivable thing, plus we know how hard a player strikes a cue ball and in what direction the balls spin, etc., it is conceivably possible to predict exactly where every single pool ball will go without looking at them. Now, we currently don't have the ability to do this, but it is possible in theory. However, if we change the pool balls, the subatomic particles, and start trying to predict where they will go with quantum mechanics, we'll hit a dead end. Quantum mechanics does not allow the scientist, even in theory, to predict exactly where every particle will go. It only allows the scientist to give a probability for where each particle will end up. Do you see the difference? Because of this, there would be no way to keep God out like some thought there would be with classical mechanics. The quantum world does not operate in a deterministic way. It is a world of probabilities, and God could easily fiddle with those probabilities. However, even if none of that were true, quantum mechanics still assumes a closed system like classical mechanics. So, even if there was some way to say exactly where every subatomic particle would be at any given point, it still wouldn't keep God out. That's because all of this would assume a closed system, and as we already talked about, God is not part of the system. So God acting in the world would not violate any rules because he's not part of the system. That means that there's really nothing in either classical mechanics or quantum mechanics that would prevent God from performing a miracle or answering a prayer. So now that we've talked about both classical and quantum mechanics, there are several other points I want to touch on. First, I've been talking about God interfering in the world. To interfere is to meddle with something you have no business meddling with. Obviously, this would not apply to God. If he made the universe, then it is his to act in and on as he pleases. Related to this, some people assume that God would not intervene in the world. I want to ask, precisely how do they know this? To comment on what God would or would not do is to do theology. At this point, we've stepped out of science, and anyone who is claiming that God would not interact in the world is no longer doing science. That person is doing theology. Second, I want to explain that while I've been using the term miracles, I really don't like it. It basically assumes a God who is absent from the world, and then occasionally sticks his finger in every now and then and messes with things. Christianity talks about a God who is living and active in our lives all the time. God is not absent and only occasionally involved. So while it might be helpful to use the word miracle for a very obvious work of God in this world, I don't think the sort of absentee landlord view of God that this implies is accurate. Finally, when we're talking about the laws of the universe, I need to point out that these laws don't actually cause anything. All they are is descriptions of what happens. That means that if things happen differently, the laws would be different. So even if all the stuff about God being outside the closed system and his actions thereby not affecting the laws don't actually apply, it wouldn't matter. The laws would simply have to take into account the actions of God because they are merely descriptions of how the universe works. They don't cause anything or allow anything. Now, I've tried to explain why I think that neither classical mechanics nor quantum mechanics makes miracles impossible. As I said previously, following the last episode of the series, I interviewed two scientists about their thoughts on science and Christianity. As part of this, I asked them whether they think science makes miracles impossible. One of them is an expert in classical mechanics, and the other is an expert in quantum mechanics, so you'll get to hear from professionals in both fields what they think about this issue. So, stick around.